Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And I don't know about you, but I'm incredibly excited to get to the bottom of this extraordinary mystery. So what did in fact happen to Gemma's mother on the old Dogwood Road? So we're going to find out, aren't we? So before we get started, you know the rules. Go and get yourself something lovely to drink. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And by all means, share these stories with anybody who enjoys a good story. You don't have to love Bigfoot to enjoy these stories because there's so many aspects to it. But before we get started, if you haven't heard part 1, part 2 and part 3, please click on the description because you don't want to miss out all the flamboyant threads that weave this tapestry together of an incredible story. So let's continue with part 4 of our story tonight. Gemma followed the woman rather gingerly into the living room that smelt a little damp and musty, but it was clean enough. Although the furniture looked as if it was stuck between a 1970s and 80s time warp, and the upholstery on some of the furnishings was so old it appeared to be faded and threadbare. So much so you couldn't even make out the original design of the fabric. But at one time, some of those furnishings might have been quite expensive, although most of the furniture did look like it had been purchased from a junkyard sale. "You better take a seat and make yourself comfortable," said the woman rather begrudgingly, pointing over to a wing chair covered in a colourful crochet blanket. "Would you like anything to drink while we're at it?" "Coffee would be great," said Gemma, secretly thinking that some caffeine in her system would brighten the ominous start to the day, as greeting Miss Fontaine at her doorstep had been like being rudely thrust into the eye of a capriciously belligerent storm, without any prior warning at all. For a moment Gemma had a fleeting respect for newspaper reporters, as dealing with women as prickly and cantankerous as Miss Fontaine could not be easy. How did you ever get information out of women like this, who was as hardened as a coconut? Jem had thought her father was a closed book growing up, but this woman, she broke the mould. She was like one of those oyster shells that would not open up without a hard yank. Miss Fontaine frowned. "I don't do coffee, but I do have ginger tea. Is that all right?" "That sounds great," said Gemma politely. "You stay there," said the woman, raising an old, very wrinkled-looking hand, like a lollipop lady at a pedestrian crossing, as if warning Gemma not to follow her into the kitchen. Gemma had no intention of doing so. "Make yourself comfortable, as I said," said the woman, pointing again to the wing chair, that at one time would have been an eye-catching feature, but it was as bedraggled and lost as everything else in the room. "I won't be a tick," she said, scuttling away with the purposeful intent of a dung beetle. If there were any small mercies for Gemma, at the very least Miss Fontaine's abrasive, rather thorny tone towards her had dissipated significantly. But still, the woman appeared unduly guarded, as if she was not altogether comfortable having Gemma in her little cottage, and was more than a little adverse to entertaining strangers at any time. So that Gemma was a little like that annoying grit that gets into an oyster shell, that eventually becomes a lustrous pearl. Gemma's keen eye surveyed her surroundings with a hawk-like interest. She got up steadily from the wing chair from which she was seated, as her narrowing eyes were drawn to a large framed photograph, standing in the middle of the mantel above the fireplace. There was a wrought-iron wood-burning stove, pride of place, at the focal point of the room, although on this warm morning the stove, although fully stacked with wood, was certainly not on. Gemma noticed a large accented wooden beam sweeping across the centre of the white ceiling, where bunches of upside-down herbs were drying, like lavender and thyme. Gemma drew in a sharp breath and walked over cautiously to the picture on the mantel, as if some unknown powerful force was dragging her to the picture against her control, as her curiosity was whipped up within her like an unbridled ocean current. She recognized the girl in the photograph to be her mother, standing next to another young lady that Gemma suspected must be Victoria Fontaine. She studied the photograph closely, lifting up the frame in her trembling fingers. For a moment she wanted more than anything else in the world to enter that photograph and to become one with it, to be standing next to those two girls in the picture, breathing in the very same fresh air that they were enjoying. Gemma's heart winced in pain, realizing that she had never ever known her mother personally, and she felt the emptiness of a space in her heart that would never be filled, for it had always been reserved for her birth mother alone. The two girls in the picture looked decidedly happy. Both were stroking a beautiful horse and smiling brightly into the camera with broad grins. Gemma could not bear to look at the photograph for a moment longer, as the pain seemed to course through her chest like spasms of hot electricity. Her straying thoughts meandered to what could have been, if only her mother were alive. She wondered what kind of relationship they would have enjoyed together. She was certain that, like her close friendship with Estelle, they would have been the very best of friends. But she would never know, as her mother was no longer around. Gemma reluctantly retired back to the wing chair, where Miss Fontaine had beckoned for her to sit. It was rather stiff and uncomfortable, having lost its padded, sumptuous upholstering over the years. She could hear the sound of Miss Fontaine clattering around in the kitchen noisily with crockery. She noticed she was being studied suspiciously by a pair of yellow eyes, glaring at her furiously from a threadbare couch that had been used as a scratching post over the years, and was also draped with another colourful crochet blanket. "What's your name?" whispered Gemma to the cat, who didn't seem remotely amused by her friendly overtures. The tortoise-shell-coloured cat glared at her, growling warningly at her under its breath. It would seem that Miss Fontaine's unfriendliness had certainly rubbed off on her cat, so like its owner, it did not welcome the presence of strangers in its sumptuous abode. Miss Fontaine entered the living room, carrying a tray that rattled rather precariously in her hands, set with mismatched porcelain cups and saucers, along with a plate of chocolate digestive cookies. With her hands still involuntarily shaking, as if she was unduly nervous about something, Miss Fontaine lowered the tray onto a large square-shaped wrought iron and wood coffee table, and proceeded to pour Gemma a cup of ginger tea from a teapot that was shaped like a house. Gemma had noticed a display of interesting quirky teapots that were shaped like houses in the far corner of the living room, displayed in a large glass cabinet that were all gathering dust. Miss Fontaine handed Gemma a cup of warm ginger tea, her fingers still trembling. The cat was hunched over, in a pouncing position, facing Gemma, growling warningly at her, oscillating a threatening claw in her direction, as if to say, "Don't you think about getting any closer to me, or I'll rip you apart with my claws." Even though Gemma loved animals, she'd clearly got the message. Some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. "Thank you," said Gemma, taking her cup of tea, rather tentatively, from Miss Fontaine, along with a chocolate digestive cookie. "Don't mind Mary Poppins over there," said the woman, referring to her cat. "She's not used to strangers, I'm afraid." Gemma had gathered as much, and sipped her tea, surprised to find it was absolutely delicious, as the warm taste of ginger spice seemed to taste like sunshine in a cup, and complemented the chocolate digestive beautifully, which Gemma ate hungrily, realizing she'd not eaten any breakfast. If no one were to look at her, she'd have happily dunked the cookie in the warm tea, but Estelle had always warned her that when you were in company, dunking cookies into tea was never advised. "You look a lot like her," said the woman, taking a sip of her own tea from the teacup, rattling it in her hands. "Like who?" asked Gemma. "Your mother, of course," said the woman, studying Gemma curiously through her blue eyes. "It's the lower half of the face, I think, and the eyes." "My dad did tell me I looked a lot like my mother," said Gemma. "When my dad was alive, he was never forthcoming about her, you see. He was rather a closed book as far as my mother was concerned. I regret that he never told me a thing about her. Well, not much. But getting anything out of him was always like extracting blood from a stone. He told me my mother had died in a car accident, and for years I visited an empty gravesite that I thought contained her remains, but it did not. It's a joke to think I'd go to that grave armed with bouquets of roses, and my mother was never actually there. It made me feel close to her going to that gravesite, It was a point of contact, you see. When I buried my father about 2 months ago, I discovered the granite slab that I'd been visiting, dedicated to my mother, was just a memorial stone. That's all it was. And that the burial plot designed for 2 coffins, 2 graves that is, only contained one, once my father was put to rest. So I knew then that something was terribly wrong. I found an old newspaper article hidden away in the back of my father's closet, gathering dust and cobwebs, which I so nearly threw away. But I read the articles. They described the car accident on the old Dogwood Road, and my mother's enigmatic disappearance, as my father had kept the truth from me for all those years. My mother could still be alive for all I know, and if she is, I'd like to find her and figure out what actually happened to her on the day of the accident. That's why I came to see you. I was hoping that you might have some answers for me." Miss Fontaine nodded her head. "Ah, so this is all beginning to make a lot of sense to me. You decided to come to this small town of ours to find answers. You read a newspaper report and you jumped to all kinds of wild conclusions. You wanted to find out all about your mother's accident and why she'd disappeared. What is there more to know, young lady? For your information, your mother is definitely deceased. I'm sorry to have to put it to you like that, but she is. I can assure you of this fact. So what more is there to know about it? If you're looking for closure, you've got it. Your mother is dead. I'd advise you to move on with your life, young lady. Your mother would want you to do the same. One thing about Sammy is she didn't believe you should live in the past or the future, but in the very moment that we're living in now. She was always saying that. Don't look back, don't look forward, but live for the moment." "With the greatest of respect, Miss Fontaine, how can you possibly know that my mother is deceased?" asked Gemma. "Do you even know my mother in person? Well, did you know her? You are Violet Fontaine, not Victoria. The article in the newspaper said it was a Victoria Fontaine that was in the accident with my mother. And she was knocked out in the accident. And when she came around, my mother had vanished into thin air. Those were the words she actually used, I believe." Miss Fontaine's teacup rattled in her hands. "You shouldn't believe everything you're told, young lady. Only foolish people do that, you know. They read a paper and they buy into the story as if it's the gospel truth. But they were not there, were they? They never saw what happened. I know what happened. I was there. I am Victoria Fontaine. But after the annoying press kept hounding me at the time, I changed my name to Violet. It was easier that way. Violet is my second name. Your mother, Sammy, was my very best friend. We were inseparable. I was in a car with her when the accident occurred. So believe me, I know everything that transpired that night. And let me just tell you one thing, young lady. The less you know about the event, the better. Take it from me. All you need to know is that your mother did not survive that grievous accident. I don't want you hanging on to the lost, beleaguered hope that she is still around somewhere, happily living out her life. I certainly wish it was true, but it is not. So it's best to tell you the truth. I know Sammy would not want her own daughter harping over her whereabouts. What good would that do? But I'm sure, even though she's deceased, she's around you all the time, watching over you. As you were the light of her entire life, believe me, I know. I assure you, if she were indeed alive, she'd have never abandoned you for a second. That much I know. She said you were the best thing that happened to her, you know." "So then you do know what happened to my mother?" asked Gemma excitedly. "You've got to tell me, Victoria, everything that happened on that night. I've got to know. Don't you think you owe it to my mother to tell me what really happened to her? I'm her daughter. I should know the truth." Violet Fontaine began to shake uncontrollably in her chair, as if she'd taken a ride on a roller coaster. Her teacup continued to wobble precariously in her hands, as if her arm had suddenly been hit by a feisty windstorm. Gemma observed her waxy complexion had become deathly white and almost ghost-like in its colour. "Believe me, girl, You don't know what you're asking me. Have you never heard the saying that sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie? Do you know what that means? It means if you wake those dogs up, chaos can ensue, and it can be grievously unsettling for everyone concerned. Sometimes it's best to let things go, to let them just be as they are. Leave them undisturbed. I promise you it's in your best interest to do so. Sometimes ignorance is bliss, and it is in this case. I am very sorry to hear that your father died recently. He was a good man, he really was. I remember him very well. Quiet as a church mouse he was, but such a gentleman. Was it a heart attack? Yes, it was a heart attack. How did you know? Well, I thought as much. Do you know your father was passionately in love with your mother? When you were born, he was as proud as Punch when you graced their lives with your presence. Your mother absolutely knew you were a girl from the very start. She couldn't wipe the smile off your father's face when you were born. He was delighted to have a girl. When Sammy and your father got together, they were inseparable. So after your mother disappeared, he was a notable wreck. I think he'd have probably topped himself if it weren't for you. As so gargantuan was his grief. You were the one thing that kept him sane, kept his feet firmly on the ground. A reason to go on living, I suspect. I knew he would die of a broken heart one day, because in the end it always catches up with you. Grief, I mean. So do yourself a very big favour, young lady. Forget you ever met me. Walk out of my cottage with dignity and grace, knowing your mother is definitely dead. That is all you need to know. I can assure you of that. I'm not leaving your cottage, Violet or Victoria or whatever you call yourself, if you don't tell me what happened on that road. Because if you don't, I'm going to park myself here all day, annoyingly so, until you tell me. And I will refuse to leave. And I'm being deadly serious. Even if your cat, Mary Poppins or whatever you choose to call her, does turn around and scratch me within an inch of my life, I still don't care. I'm not going to budge an inch until you start talking. And I mean business. To Gemma's surprise, the woman chuckled. A tear spilled down her cheek, which she quickly snatched away hurriedly with the back of her long sleeve. Ha! Goodness gracious me! You are funny, Gemma. I'll give you that. You are a carbon copy of your mother. She was as mulishly stubborn as you are, equally as determined. I remember refusing to tell her something once, and word for word she said exactly what you're saying now. Very well, I'll tell you the entire story, but I promise you one thing, it's not going to be easy to listen to. Look at me. I'm a hermit these days. I live on my own. The people in town think I'm an oddball, and I like it that way, believe it or not. I was never the same after that car accident. It completely shipwrecked my entire life. I never married, never had children of my own, never had a desire to pursue that path, or any other path for that matter. My ambition died with your mother on that night. I was too broken up for all that. When something so dreadful happens, you cannot unsee it, you know. And ever since that harrowing ordeal, my life, it has never been the same. You should go for counselling, said Gemma. That's what people do in New York. It really works. Did your father go for counselling after your mother vanished? Asked Violet quizzically. No, but that's different, said Gemma, shaking her head. My dad, well, he's not, the counselling type. You couldn't exactly drag him to counselling, and you'd have to if you wanted him to go. He'd kick and scream and make such a fuss. It would be impossible to get him to go and have a counselling session. And why is that? Asked Violet. He didn't believe in all that stuff. Well, there you go, then. Neither do I. I'm on the same page as your father there. Do you really think I want to go to a counsellor and harp on and on about the very thing that destroyed my life? I have a brother, who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder after the war in Iraq, in Operation Desert Storm, I believe it was, if my memory serves me correct. Wretched business the whole damn thing was, and I blame the government of the time, sending our boys off to Iraq to get killed or maimed under the guise of removing threatening weapons of mass destruction under Saddam Hussein's regime that never ever existed in the first place. I believe unequivocally it was the quintessential excuse to pilferage the country's oil and wealth, just to make us in America richer, at the expense of losing so many good people. I believe that is what it was all about, and for what. When my poor brother returned home from Iraq, he didn't disagree. He felt as if the army had been used by the powers that be to satisfy their insatiable greed at the cost of their lives. He was a different man, you know. The light in him had burned out. He had seen far too much. That's what war does to you, you know. Ostensibly, the army insisted that for my brother's well-being, he saw one psychologist after another for counselling. And you know what it did for him? Absolutely nothing. It made him go over and over the traumas he had faced in Iraq. In his head, he relived it so graphically, he couldn't take it a moment longer. He told me himself that these so-called experts were doing his head in. I saw how he was after every counselling session. It was as if the therapists were clawing away at an old wound, making it bleed over and over again, getting worse and worse, festering with the infection of my brother's melancholia. It was days later, my poor brother, my beautiful, beautiful brother, with the kindest, most gentle heart. He went and hung himself in a closet. He could bear it no longer. He told me the counselling made it 1,000 times worse. They want me to talk about my feelings, he told me. I don't want to relive the most traumatic event in my entire life. I want to forget it. I don't want to go over the same old ground again and again, like a dog having its nose thrust into its own vomit. I don't want to think about the things we were forced to do, the torture, the barbarity of it all, the lives so needlessly lost. And for what? He was right, you know. And I feel much the same about the accident I experienced on the old Dogwood Road. We were fools going there, your mother and I. But I cannot take back what happened. If I could, I would. I've blamed myself for many years, you know. I should never have listened to your mother, but that's a whole nother story. I'm so sorry, said Gemma. I had no idea. You've certainly had it terribly rough. And I'm so sorry about your brother's suicide and the sacrifices he made for our country. You're not the only person I've met that believes there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq at the time, and that it was a cunning guise to go into the country to ransack and raid all their oil. Many Americans like myself believe it was to satisfy a gluttonous greed. Of course there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, said Violet insistently. My brother said as much. I think many people have established that by now. Just think of all the American lives so needlessly lost. It makes me so dreadfully sick. Violet began to rock up and down in a chair as she reflected over her late brother. Gemma was sure she could see that her eyes were like heavy clouds, eager to burst their banks. But she restrained her tears. My brother said he saw things in Iraq he could never ever unsee. Stuff he never wanted to talk about, even to me, and we were incredibly close, you know. There was not much he did not tell me. I feel much the same about what happened to me on the old Dogwood Road. I've been spending every day of my life trying to forget all about these things, and your coming here has opened up a whole can of worms for me. I'm so sorry about that. I really am, Violet. And I'm also sorry that counselling didn't work for your brother. But I do believe it helps some people. I mean, these experts are supposed to know what they're doing. I have a friend who lost her son in a freak accident. She claims the therapist she's seeing saved her life. So what is good for the goose isn't always good for the gander. We're all different, I suspect. What is one man's medicine is another man's poison. You're very right about that, said Violet ruefully. My brother should never have had counselling. I think he'd blocked it all away, the bad memories, I mean. At the back of his mind, like an old suitcase that you leave in the attic to gather dust. There is a very strong possibility he'd still be around today. I'm sorry, young lady, but I'm very cynical about the modern world and all its flaky promises. For me personally, I believe in trying to fight the demons from the past on my own. And I'm doing just fine, as you can see. Gemma did not think that Violet Fontaine was doing particularly well, shutting herself away in a cottage like this, and living like a hermit. But who was she to judge? Maybe the woman, much like her late brother, would be worse off if she had counselling, which certainly did not have appeared to have helped her brother. She did know many people had returned from Iraq, never the same again, having seen things you can't unsee, having witnessed the most brutal side of human nature, and having done things in wartime that no human being would want to ever do. How did you ever get over taking another person's life under the flag of war? It couldn't be easy at the very best of times. All that Gemma did know was that something traumatic had happened to her mother on the old Dogwood Road, and once the mystery was unlocked by the woman who had the key in her hand, who was warning her about opening this mystery box of skeletons that she had recommended remain buried, there would be no going back. Gemma knew she could get up and leave the cottage like Violet Fontaine had recommended. But what had happened to her mother, Samantha Barton, on the night she appeared to have vanished into thin air? Gemma needed to know the answers to that question. Her need to know was so great she was willing to live with the consequences of an unsavoury knowledge that might jeopardize her peace of mind, as it had done so clearly for Violet Fontaine. Violet put down her teacup onto the coffee table and pulled out some crocheting from a big bag at the bottom of the settee. "I like to crochet," she said. "When I talk, it makes things easier for me." "Go ahead," said Gemma. Violet Fontaine's account of the night on the old Dogwood Road. "I remember that dreadful accident on the old Dogwood Road incredibly well. The whole event is so clear it's as if it happened yesterday, and I wish I did not, but there you go. Your mother and I were, as you know, the very best of friends, had been since kindergarten, I think it was. We'd both done a typing and shorthand course together, and had become secretaries. Your mother was brilliant at shorthand, and was earning a good salary, working for a man called Revel Bassett. He was a good man, you know. Originally from Boston, I believed, but moved over here to enjoy the benefits of a quiet Montana town. I can't remember what kind of business it was, but it was something to do with tourism connected to Yellowstone National Park, and raising more awareness to the public, in attracting more foreign visitors to our part of the world. Me and your mother, we'd both meet up after work for a girls' night out every Friday evening to rewind after a day spent in the office at the local bar in town. It was a traditional thing for us to do. We did it every Friday night without fail. We'd enjoy a bite to eat together, along with a few drinks. Your father always agreed to take care of you, as you were a tiny wee thing back then. Your father was a very considerate gentleman, you know. He'd tell your mother she needed time with her girlfriends, and it was an absolute pleasure for him to look after you. Your parents could afford to hire an au pair to look after you during the day, while they worked. But the au pair your parents hired was never available at night for some very strange reason. I think she had a boyfriend at the time she liked to hang around with. She was quite a little thing in her teens, I believe. It was one day in the bar that we overheard a couple of young men talking about the old Dogwood Road of all things, and strange things that had happened on that road. So our ears were wagging, eavesdropping onto a conversation we probably should not have listened to. One of the young men was saying that he'd never venture out onto the old Dogwood Road ever again. "Something's not right about that Dogwood Road," he was saying, shaking his head furiously. "I've never believed in all the rumours about the old Dogwood Road. I thought, like any old town, we had our mysterious legends, and I didn't want to be swept away by the whimsical suggestions of a fertile imagination. All my life I've been a perennial cynic.
Never believed in ghosts or monstrous beasts. But now I beg to differ about all that. I was driving down the old Dogwood Road in the middle of the night. Very dark night it was, too. Inauspicious. Not a good feeling in the air, I have to say. I was listening to the Bee Gees to put me in a good mood on the radio. But I'm telling you, something very bizarre happened. A gust of ice-cold air entered my car, like a large whoosh of energy. It's the only way I can describe it. And all the windows were closed, so I could not explain that experience. It was a warm night, let me tell you, but the temperature in my car plummeted significantly, and I got a profound sense I was not alone, and that someone was sitting right next to me on the passenger seat. It felt like a formidable, menacious presence, sending goosebumps of trepidation trickling down my spine. I absolutely knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was not alone. I put my hand on the seat next to mine. It almost burnt my fingers. I felt like I'd put my hand on an icy block of ice. Oh, my word, there are no words. It freaked the hell out of me. I began to press down the accelerator of my truck as hard as I possibly could to get off the old Dogwood Road. But my truck refused to move forward, and I had a full tank of gas in my car. But the car just did not budge, not even an inch. I couldn't start the engine because it kept dying on me. It would splutter into life and then fade as fast as it started. And I don't mind admitting, I was cursing like a sailor. I was so frustrated. Then I felt someone breathing down my neck with an icy breath. I cannot describe the level of terror I felt. It shot through me. From a 6 to a 10++. I could stand it no longer. I got out of the car, hightailed it down the old Dogwood Road as fast as I possibly could, and all the while something was running behind me, pounding the ground so heavily with ponderous feet. I thought I was being chased by something gargantuan in size. I could hear this sizable invisible entity spluttering and heaving and coughing, gaining ground behind me, getting closer and closer and closer. And I don't mind admitting to you, my life flashed before my very eyes. And for a brief second, I genuinely thought my number was up. I got the ominous sense that I was in mortal danger. But I physically could not see a damn thing. Do you have any idea how annoying that is? You know you are being followed, but you cannot see what is following you. But something was there. I could feel it with every fibre of my being. And I did not dare look back. But once I'd left the road and was running through the tall, lofty trees, I took the Croydon trail to the Croydon's farmhouse, which I knew very well. I looked back through the trees, and I saw a pair of yellow eyes at about 8 foot off the ground, staring at me. Nothing else. I didn't see a shape or a size or a thing. I just saw the eyes. I ran to the Croydon farmhouse, and thankfully Dr. Croydon let me in. He's a good man, you know. Gave me some sedatives to calm me down. Insisted I stayed overnight at his farmhouse. There are things out there, he said to me. Things you cannot imagine. You need to stay here overnight. We'll get your truck back in the morning when it's safe. So I agreed to stay overnight. It was his wife, Mary Lou, who fussed around me like a mother hen, saying, "I keep telling people not to venture down the old Dogwood Road, you know, but some people just won't listen." even when I offer them well-meaning advice, they always think they know better. She asked me if I'd picked up a ghostly female hitchhiker on the Dogwood Road, and was that the reason for my obvious distress? She told me she'd done it before herself, and never again. I chose not to scare her by telling her about my bizarre encounter with a gargantuan invisible energy that had doggedly pursued me down the road. She told me one night she'd returned to the Croydon farmhouse and saw a young girl hitchhiking on the Dogwood Road in the middle of the night. I was quite confounded, she told me. I thought to myself, what on earth is a young lady doing on the road in the middle of the night, hitchhiking a lift at this God-forsaken hour, when she's a sitting duck for predators or any weirdos crossing her path with duplicitous intent? She told me that over the years, with so many visitors visiting Yellowstone National Park, that they'd had their fair share of weirdos passing through her neck of the woods. One of those trespassers, I believe, was a German man who was built like the Incredible Hulk, was shaven like a skinhead, and had tattoos all over his head and his chest. He insisted on camping in their woods, claiming it was a free world, and he could do the hell what he liked, even though the Croydon property is privately owned, as you well know. The following day the Croydons found his camping site in the trees had been abandoned. There was pools of blood lying everywhere. The man was nowhere to be found. The tent looked like it had been put through a paper shredder, and items of the man's camping gear were hanging up in the trees, pots and pans, like Christmas decorations, you know. Suffice to say, they never did find out what happened to him. But it turned out he did return to Germany safe and well. But why he abandoned his stuff, God only knows. And as for the blood at the scene, that's even stranger. But the police inquiries got nothing out of that German tourist, beyond the fact that he'd never set foot in America ever again. It was a weird place, that's what he said. I asked Dr. Croydon's wife to tell me more about this female hitchhiker, because I've heard a lot about her over the years. They say she was killed in the 1960s, I believe. She says the woman was hitching a ride at 12:30 at night. She thought the woman could come to harm, standing there alone like that. I knew I would take her home with me, offer her a bed for the night. I rolled up in my car, like you do, and I killed the engine, and I leaned over to the passenger side door to pull up the knob, telling her to get into the car. She didn't hesitate, you know. It was a freezing cold night, but when the woman entered my car, the temperature got decidedly freezing. I thought I'd walked into a cold box. I was breathing out clouds of white condensation. But this woman was not, you know, and it struck me as decidedly odd. But I remember lecturing her about the dangers of hitchhiking in the middle of the night. She told me she wanted to go to Maggie's. I thought she was referring to a friend's place, not a boarding house that used to exist for backpackers in the 1960s. That has long since closed down. I told her when we got back to my house, she could use our landline to phone her friend Maggie to tell her that she was safe and well, and would see her in the morning. She was so quiet on the journey that I turned around to look at her and discovered she was not there. And then it all came back to me. The memories of the old Dogwood Road and the so-called hitchhiker from the 1960s. And that was when it hit me, like a brick to the head, that I had lifted her ghost. The young man in the bar continued with his story. Mrs. Croydon's story confounded me, I have to say. I didn't meet a female hitchhiker on the old Dogwood Road, but something certainly crossed my path that night that I knew was far from good. The next morning, Dr. Croydon came with me onto the Dogwood Road to retrieve my truck. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. My truck had been violently vandalized, scratched, and all the upholstering ripped and torn out of the seats. Mr. Croydon's words were, "Bloody hell! What happened here?"
Violet paused for a brief moment, leaning forwards to the coffee table to take another sip of her ginger tea that Gemma suspected was now cold. Her body physically stiffened, as if she was not looking terribly forward to delivering the last quarter of her story. "I'm not sure what else the man was saying. His friend kept saying, 'My God, that is the most dreadful story I've ever heard. You won't get me venturing down that old Dogwood Road if you paid me $1 million in cash notes.' But then the waitress arrived to bring their food over, and the rest of the bleary, distorted conversation somehow got lost in the crossfire, I'm afraid. But me and your mother had become so riveted by what we'd heard about the old Dogwood Road, after eavesdropping on the most fascinating story we'd ever heard. Of course, we'd heard the rumours over the years, the wild speculation about the ghostly spectres said to haunt the old Dogwood Road. But we'd always taken it with a pinch of salt, as you do. But after hearing that young man's absurd account, I hasten to say that both me and your mother were absolutely piqued with curiosity. Sparked, you could say, like a candle that's been lit that you simply can't blow out. Your mother leaned towards me and said, 'My God, did you hear all that, Victoria? Can you believe what that guy just said? I'm so glad we had a girls' night out tonight, because that is the most interesting story I've ever heard in my entire life.' I nodded. How could I not agree with that? 'Do you think it's true?' she asked me excitedly. 'Of course it's true,' I said. 'I don't doubt it for a second. My dad drove down that old Dogwood Road once, and he said every hair was standing up on the back of his neck. So yes, I believe it. I don't think that young man was making it up. Did you hear how shaken he sounded?' So there we are. That's the end of part 4 of our story. It's building up to become very exciting, so I hope you're going to join me for part 5 tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.